We're going to start Chapter 5 today. Chapter 5 is on psychology and our health. We're going to talk about things like eating habits. We're going to talk about drug use, stuff like that. But first we'll start with stress and how it relates to our health and well-being. Stress was a recent chapter we covered, so it's a good little bridge between the two chapters, psychology and health and stress. Of course, we know there's a connection between these two things. Heart disease, stress, and personality all can be connected. Inflammation of the arteries, clogging of the arteries can all, of course, negatively impact our health, and these are potentially connected to how we handle stress, and how we handle stress is connected to potentially our personality traits. So a lot of studies have done focus on type A personality versus type B and how they handle stress, and of course how they handle stress could determine how they are in terms of overall health. And of course type A personalities have three key components: strong competitive orientation, impatience and time urgency, and anger and hostility. Of course, these are related to stress, and that anger hostility component is potentially directly related to the clogging of the arteries. So research has shown that individuals with above average hostility scores are twice as likely to have that atherosclerosis or clogging of the arteries than those who have below average hostility scores. So there's a definite potential for connection there. Stress and other diseases. So if you have life stress hanging over you, you could suffer headaches, hypertension, IBD, or inflammatory bowel disease, gastrointestinal disorders. You might be more susceptible to infections. We talked about how stress can negatively impact your immune system, and that's why a lot of students during finals end up getting sick because they get run down, stressed, and their immune system becomes compromised. Here's a chart from your textbook, a long list of health problems and how they might be linked to stress and, of course, psychology overall. All right. So as mentioned, stress in your immune system is a connection there. So your body's defense against infections, whether they be bacterial or viral. Stress can cause a suppression of the immune system, and virtually all research is correlational. So you can't conclusively demonstrate that stress causes illness. However, there's a lot of potential for the research there. Habits, lifestyle, and health. So there's a connection here in terms of what sort of habits do you engage in, and how do those habits impact your overall health. So unhealthy habits can account for a lot of premature deaths. Leading behavioral causes of death include alcohol consumption, unsafe driving, risky sexual behavior, and illicit drug use. Right, so of course there's a psychological component for each of those, and they are directly related to your health. Some people exhibit unrealistic optimism when they are talking about these types of behaviors like alcohol consumption and illicit drug use. They might be fully aware of the potential negative physical impact of doing these things. However, they are overly optimistic on how they're going to handle it, or they're overly optimistic on how their body is going to handle it. So they think, I know it's not good for me, but it'll be fine, right? And it actually becomes a habit and not fine in a lot of cases as I drink my coffee. Smoking, of course, one of the major bad habits that can cause health issues, greater risk of premature death. So it can take 13 to 14 years off of somebody's life expectancy. lung cancer, as well as high-risk other forms of cancer, hypertension, stroke, cardiac disease, all play a role. Again, people know this, right? They know this going into, I guarantee almost every person knows today of the negative effects of smoking prior to taking that first puff of a cigarette, but they're overly optimistic. Oh, it's just fine. I'm not going to get hooked. It won't become a habit for me. I'm not going to do all that. But the problem is it's very difficult to quit smoking. If people give up smoking, studies show that their health risks decline reasonably quickly. So there is optimism. If you quit smoking, there's almost immediately positive health effects once you quit. And they will continue to improve if the person can still quit. But it's very difficult. Nicotine withdrawal is very it's difficult to handle, and there's behavioral aspects as well of smoking that really cause it to be difficult to be successful in quitting. All right. Drinking. Why do people drink? There's a certain who cares brand of euphoria that temporarily boosts your self-esteem. Drinking is in our society is widely endorsed. It's part of our culture. It's part of our social rituals. Most social events in our society are alcohol related. Drinking dulls negative emotions such as tension, worry, anxiety, and depression. So those stressful times, alcohol will temporarily alleviate some of those feelings. That's good emotional-based coping strategy where like I just want to feel a bit better, right, temporarily, but we know it's a bad strategy long term. Also, alcohol makes people feel relaxed in social settings, right, and that's why it's so closely linked to our social gatherings, is because it helps people become relaxed and more social to some degree. Short-term risks and problems. So of course the hangover is itself the short-term issue, so feeling terrible the next day because of withdrawal symptoms. There's also the potential for overdose, especially if you mix alcohol with other drugs like sedatives or narcotics. Poor judgment, reduced intellectual functioning can cause you to engage in risky behavior, right? And poor motor control can cause accidents and injuries. Long-term risks and social costs, alcohol dependency, so you might become an alcoholic, which has a lot of negative physical effects and can cause social issues as well, right? So loss of job, loss of friends and family members. Okay, we'll talk about more on drugs later on. Let's talk about eating habits. Right? There's a lot of psychology and culture around food. Right? People don't realize just how much psychology there is around our eating habits, and how our eating habits can affect our overall health. Right? So if I often ask my class, right? If you were given the choice, you don't have to eat any meals ever again. You just take a pill, and all your nutritional necessities will be taken care of. You won't be hungry. Would you do it? But you can't eat ever again. Almost everybody says, no, I don't want to do that. Right? Why? Well, because eating is, again, kind of like alcohol. Right? Meals are a big part of our social gatherings. Right? It's a big part of our social events. Right? And there's a big cultural component, and there's a lot of positive feelings we get from food that would be lost if we would never eat meals again. All right. So, but again, there's cultural components to this. There's psychological components. I'll show you a clip. Well, feel free to watch this clip on the heart attack grill. and it taps into some of those cultural and psychological components. In this video, the person who runs the restaurant even talks about how this is in America, how in America this is their right to sell you this food, and it's your right to buy it and to potentially kill yourself if you want to. And actually, in some ways, that's what a lot of people are doing when they eat this way, but they feel like it's the right, and they're not going to be denied that right if they want to do it. Right? Okay, so we also have different reactions to illness. So the process of seeking treatment has 3 key stages. So we must decide that our physical sensations are symptoms of an illness. So we have to first identify that, okay, these symptoms are underlying an illness that needs to be addressed. We must decide that our symptoms warrant medical care. Like, okay, so we have these symptoms, we think it's connected to an illness, right? Do I need to go get medical care for that? If the answer is yes, that's the next step. And then we have to arrange for medical care, of course. Making an appointment, preparing to pay, that's usually not the case in Canada. So this is an American textbook, so they have a different system down there, and oftentimes before going and seeking medical attention, the ability to pay for that attention is a factor that has to be addressed. Some people seem to enjoy the sick role. They seem to be comfortable and almost seek out this sick role because there's benefits potentially to being in that role, right? One, it absolves you from responsibility. I couldn't do it. Sorry, I was sick, right? So there's fewer demands placed on you if you're seen as being sick. Illness can provide face-saving excuses. You didn't do well. You failed that test while I was sick going in, right? So it allows you to save face if you don't achieve certain things. And we also know sick people receive more attention. Oftentimes people can fall into that trap of liking that type of attention, and so they'll almost seek out being sick so that they can garner that further attention, right? That coddling. All right, the effects of drugs. So we're going to talk about drugs. If you've taken my drugs class, some of this is going to be review for you. If you haven't, we're going to go through the different types of drugs and some of the effects of those drugs have on us. So we have drug-related concepts. We have this idea of recreational drugs, right? Usually fall into one of 5 common categories, right? More on that in a second. Most drugs produce tolerance effects, right? So meaning it takes more of a drug to get to that initial experience. So let's use the example of alcohol. The first time somebody drinks alcohol, it's probably not going to take too much for them to get inebriated, right? But if they continue to drink alcohol over the months or years, what happens is they develop tolerance to that alcohol, so it's going to take them more alcohol to get to that original buzzed feeling that they had the first time they used it, right? So it takes more alcohol, more consumption of that drug to get that initial experience. Users will oftentimes develop physical or psychological dependence on a drug, right? So the physical meaning they'll potentially suffer through withdrawal effects, and they'll want to use the drug to alleviate those withdrawal effects. So they become physically dependent. They physically don't feel well unless the drug is in their system. But there's also psychological dependence where they're like craving the drug psychologically, right? So they may not have the physical hooks in them, but psychologically they're feeling compelled to want to use the drug. All right, so there's different categories of drugs here. So down the left you see narcotics. That would include things like morphine, heroin, fentanyl, sedatives like barbiturates, stimulants, amphetamines, cocaine, hallucinogens, LSD, psilocybin, the active ingredient magic mushrooms. And then cannabis gets a category all its own because researchers didn't know where to put it, and so they just said, screw it, cannabis is just its own category because it just doesn't fit right into the others. It kind of overlaps with some, but doesn't fit completely, and it's just like too hard to try to come up with it. So it gets its own category. So here's some risks associated with each of these drugs or categories of drugs. All right, so you can see things like narcotics. Tolerance is rapid, meaning quickly you build a tolerance to this drug. So let's use the example of heroin. All right, so you use a little bit of heroin, you get that feeling, that desired high. Right, and it's quickly you're going to need more of that to get that same high. So the risk of physical dependence is extremely high with narcotics. The risk of psychological dependence also high, and the risk of fatal overdose very high, right? So it checks all the boxes into why narcotics are such a potential danger, right? So tolerance, physical dependence, psychological dependence, and potential for overdose. And we see that today with the fentanyl epidemic, and more on that in a minute. Sedatives are similar. Tolerance is rapid and then high across the board in terms of physical, psychological dependence and potential for overdose. Stimulants, also very risky. Physical dependence, moderate. Psychological is high. Potential for overdose, moderate to high. Hallucinogens, tolerance is gradual, right? And in some cases, almost flat, right? So LSD, for example, you're not going to get much tolerance if you, for some reason, used it even semi-regularly. You're not going to feel like you have to take 10 hits to get that feeling that you got over one. Risk of physical dependence, no, not there. Psychological dependence, very low. Potential overdose, very low for many of these. Cannabis, gradual tolerance, no, very little physical dependence, low to moderate psychological, and overdose potential, very low, obviously. Okay, so we talked about physical dependence. So exists when a person must continue the drug to avoid those withdrawal symptoms. Most severe heroin and barbiturates, very difficult and dangerous. Even people can often die just from the withdrawal effects of things like barbiturates. And even alcohol, if someone's a chronic alcoholic and they just decide to go cold turkey, they have to be very careful because some people have actually died from the withdrawal effects alone. Psychological dependence, so this is when a person must take the drug to satisfy that craving. And an overdose, obviously excessive amount of the drug that can cause life-threatening experiences. So narcotics, drugs derived from opium. I'll post a slide, the breakdown of the opiates. The effects, so the main effects of heroin and other narcotics is an intense feeling of euphoria, so feeling good, and pain relief. Side effects, nausea, drowsiness, constipation, slowed respiration. If you take too much, that's why it's extremely dangerous, is that everything slows down sometimes to the point of stopping, right? So your respiratory system stops working. Very high risk, as mentioned, for overdose and potentially other diseases if you share needles. So opium is a product of the opium poppy. Derivatives are called opiates. They used to distinguish opiates and opioids. Now we just call them opioids. Some examples of these would be morphine, codeine, and heroin, right? So I'll show you a breakdown. Two major effects: pain relief and euphoria. So here's a breakdown here. Right, this is from my drugs textbook, but it's a nice little chart that shows opium at the top here. So we get this from the poppy, and then from there we get things like morphine, codeine, thebaine, and then you'll recognize some of these other brand names of these opioid derivatives, of course heroin, but things like oxycodone, so Percocets, Oxycontin, right? So these are all things that are become well known for good and bad over the recent decades, and then also fentanyl would fall under here as well. Heroin actually, ironically, was developed by the Bayer company to help people who were addicted to morphine. So there was a time where morphine was like an epidemic. People were hooked on morphine. So Bayer developed this new drug that was even more effective in pain relief, but they promoted it as being less addictive. So they're like, don't worry about your morphine addiction. We got a drug for you. It's called heroin. You should give it a try. But of course, this was completely misleading, and heroin, of course, as we know, is extremely addictive as well. It was also, by the way, promoted over the counter. You could buy it to help your cough, because heroin actually is a cough suppressant as well. So Bayer used to sell it to help people with their cough. And of course, there's a pattern with the drug and the drug companies that you will notice, right? Morphine gave way to heroin because they made heroin because morphine was too addictive, and then they developed heroin, right? But then they kept developing drugs to be helpful in pain relief, right? Thinking that they would be less addictive, but none of them have been less addictive, and actually each one seems to lead to another epidemic, right? So Oxycontin, for years became an issue, and is still an issue today. People becoming addicted to these prescription drugs, right? People going in and suffering from pain. Again, this is very effective in alleviating that pain, but it can be very quickly lead to addiction, and then ultimately becomes used as a street drug. So people are searching it out. And then eventually this is going to make way for fentanyl, right? So fentanyl, I'll post a couple of video links here giving you some background, but fentanyl is a very effective opioid in terms of alleviating pain. It originally came in like a patch that person would put on their skin, and would slowly release over a 48 to 72 hour time period, a little bit of pain relief so that person didn't have to keep taking pills. Like somebody suffering from cancer or chronic pain, this was a godsend because it would allow them to have pain relief without having to take pills. And you can see here just how powerful fentanyl is. So this amount of heroin right here is the equivalent to this amount of fentanyl, just a few little bit in there, right? But this is why it's also so dangerous, is because it is so powerful, right? People often don't know how much they're taking, and they can quickly overdose, and that overdose can lead to death, right? And you may have heard of even a more powerful thing than fentanyl right now, and that's carfentanil. And just to continue with the comparison, heroin to fentanyl, fentanyl to carfentanil. Look at it, it's almost non-existent in there. That is enough. That's the equivalent of this, which is the equivalent of this. Right? Carfentanil was originally used to sedate large animals like bison or rhinos. Right? This is how powerful carfentanil is. Right? And the fact that humans would even consider taking it is shocking to people who know just how powerful it is. So vets who are dealing with this, right, and have been using carfentanil for years, can't believe that it's starting to be found on the street because it is just so deadly. Right? Just the human body isn't made to sustain that level of potency for this drug. I'm going to post another link focusing on the fentanyl crisis and the issues faced by frontline workers. So the clip is from BC, where a lot of the fentanyl epidemic is peaking. However, it's not restricted to the West Coast. Fentanyl is now an issue coast to coast here in Canada, and it's an epidemic that needs to be addressed. But you can have a video link there that shows you just some of the issues and some of the problems that the emergency room medical workers are dealing with because of this fentanyl crisis. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. We'll continue on with this next lecture. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.